So, welcome to lesson 2.5, Structure and Agency. Now, as theoretical historians, we're interested in historical patterns. And as this course will show, we do indeed seem to find such patterns. And this suggests that humans have no control over human affairs, that there are these historical patterns that work themselves out according to their own logic, and it doesn't really matter what we do, we can't affect it. Well, that goes against the idea that we humans have free will and can shape our own destiny. And although some people argue that free will is an illusion, it certainly feels as though we have choices and we can make decisions that affect our own lives and the world around us. So, welcome to the structure-agency debate. Which is about whether history is driven by human agency, by people making things happen, by people's individual actions, or whether it's driven by these impersonal socio-historical patterns and laws that happen at the level of the whole society. And one person who very much believed in human agency was the historian Thomas Carlyle in his 1841 book On Heroes. And he said that history is driven by the actions of certain geniuses like Martin Luther and Napoleon. These people affect the world of their time and subsequent history. And he said that history is therefore just the biography of great men. And someone who argued against that was Leo Tolstoy in his War and Peace, 1869. He said, well, no, if you actually look at Napoleon's battles, Napoleon was in his headquarters, and by the time that the reports reached him from the battlefield, they were already out of date. And by the time that Napoleon had written up new orders and sent them out to the front line, the situation had changed so much that his orders were irrelevant. So in what sense can we say that Napoleon was driving the battle when he didn't know what was happening and his orders couldn't be executed? And so what Tolstoy said was that the real shaping of the course of the battle depended on the actions of many low-level individual soldiers and commanders within the army. So it was a sergeant who happened to shoot an enemy officer, or it was a young officer who was able to encourage his men not to run away and to go back into the fight. It was these many individual low-level actions that determined the course of the battle and the outcome of the battle. And so he said that this applies in history as a whole. It's many individual actions, and history is the swarm life of humanity. It's something in which we all participate. All our actions and decisions contribute to the overall flow of events. And the big historian David Christian has said that it's when you look on the large scale that structure becomes dominant and important. Yes, at the low level, individual choices and decisions may make a difference, but on the large scale, it's all about structure. So if it depends on the decisions of individuals and of everybody, then that's millions of people, millions of decisions going on at every moment. Then any one decision makes little difference, and what really determines it is overall properties of human nature, which affect the kinds of decisions that are made. And he gives the example of agriculture. Saying that the invention of agriculture wasn't down to one genius who had the idea of planting a seed, even though we're often told that as a kind of simplifying narrative. Agriculture arose because people needed to find better ways of securing their food supply in a world that was becoming increasingly populated, and just living off the land was no longer viable. And the evidence for that is that agriculture arose pretty much simultaneously all around the world, and reflected then the fact that the conditions, this increasingly populous society, applied all around the world and generated similar responses in every place to find people managing their food supply more actively. And another example we might mention is, say, Columbus discovering America. I don't think many people would really say that if Columbus had never been born, then Europeans would still not know that America existed. The reality is that in Columbus's day, Europeans were already spreading out into the world. There was a kind of expanding bubble as their ocean transport was improving, their knowledge of other parts of the world was improving, and their desire to reach those parts of the world to trade with them was increasing. And it just so happened that it was Columbus who was on the edge of this expanding bubble who happened to touch America. But if it hadn't been Columbus, someone in very short time after that it would have been them instead. But the discovery of America didn't depend on Columbus's idea and his decision to go and get funding for his voyage. It was a structural consequence of what was happening in Europe at that time. And similarly, we could say with Luther. He came up with his criticism of the Catholic Church that eventually led to the Reformation and Protestantism. But if Luther had been going around criticising the Church in earlier times, he might well have just been arrested and burned at the stake as a heretic and not had any effect. The reason he was able to have an effect is because the Europe of his day was increasingly receptive to such ideas. People were better educated, they were more urban, and there was also the printing press allowing a greater flow of information. So it wasn't really so much the fact that Luther existed as that the European population of his day was tuned in to such ideas and was able then to enact them. So this is leading us to the idea that agency becomes subsumed at a high level, and it is structure. But we could be falling into the trap of thinking that just because something happened, that it was bound to happen. And so this leads us on to the question of the role of chance in history. So in 30 BC, the Roman general Marc Antony was fighting Octavian, who was the adopted heir of Julius Caesar, who was long dead by then, for the future of the Roman Empire. And Antony was allied with Cleopatra of Egypt. And Antony and Cleopatra decided to fight a naval battle against Octavian, which they lost. And so Octavian went on to become the in control of the Roman Empire, and he became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, and meant that Rome would be ruled by emperors ever after. So he shaped the future of the Roman Empire, and then in the whole history of the world really after that. And it's been said that it was unfortunate that Antony fought Octavian Augustus at sea, because Antony was a much better general on land, and if he'd only decided to fight Octavian on land, he might well have won, and then the whole future history of the Roman Empire and of the world would have been very different. And the reason he decided to fight Octavian at sea was because he was under the influence of Cleopatra, who had a much better navy than she had land forces, so she favoured a naval battle. And the reason Antony was persuaded by Cleopatra was because he was in love with her. And so it's been said that if Cleopatra's appearance had been a bit different, maybe if her nose had been a bit longer, then Antony might never have fallen in love with her. Then he might not have listened to her, and he might have fought Octavian on land, and so he would have won, and everything would have been very different. So this is the Cleopatra's nose theory of history. Standing for the idea that one chance event can steer the whole of history for the whole human race down a completely different path. And another example of that is that the English king Henry VIII wanted a male heir, but his queen Catherine of Aragon didn't give him a son, at least not one that survived to adulthood. And so he wanted to try with another wife, and he had to marry such another wife, because otherwise his son would be illegitimate. So, but he couldn't marry another wife until he'd got a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. And the problem was that the Pope didn't grant him a divorce. So Henry took England out of the control of the papacy and made England into a Protestant country, what is known as the English Reformation. And it's been said that the reason that the Pope wouldn't grant Henry a divorce was because he was under the influence of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who controlled Italy at that time, where the Pope resided. And but Charles V was very lucky to be in control of Italy, because he'd only recently been challenged for the control of Italy by the French. And the reason he escaped was because an outbreak of typhus decimated the French army, and so the French army decided to withdraw, leaving Charles V in control of Italy. But if it hadn't been for that outbreak of typhus, then all those things would have been different. Charles V would not have been around in Italy to influence the Pope. The Pope would then probably have been willing to grant Henry a divorce. Henry would have been able to then marry someone else without having to reject the authority of the Pope, and the English Reformation would never have happened. So it was that outbreak of typhus that resulted in the English Reformation. Like Cleopatra's nose, one chance it shaped future events in a massive way. Well, yes, but we might say, well, why just stop with this outbreak of typhus? There are other issues of chance at work here. For example, what if Catherine had given Henry a son in the first place? Then none of this would have happened. And also, later on, after Henry, his successor, Queen Mary, tried to take Britain back into the Roman Catholic Church. But she didn't succeed because the English population generally was in favour of Protestantism. So the reason Henry was able to reject the authority of the papacy was because his subjects at that time were very receptive to the idea of Protestantism. So that was another kind of piece of chance that contributed to this. And we could also say the very fact that Luther had existed and developed Protestant ideas, giving Henry something he could latch on to as his reason for rejecting the papacy, was another piece of chance. And also it was chance that Gutenberg had invented the printing press, which meant that Luther's ideas were able to spread, because otherwise, you know, Luther might have, he posted his complaints on the church door at Wittenberg, but it might have just petered out. The fact that it grew into this huge movement out of control was because of Gutenberg's invention. And I also mentioned in a previous lesson how the Black Death could be seen as contributing to this, because it, for one thing, it undermined the authority of the church, because people said, well, you know, the church is supposed to pray for our well-being, and yet it's manifestly failed. You know, Europe's been drastically affected by this terrible plague, killing many people. The church has, you know, not been praying properly. It's let us down. And it also, because it wiped out a lot of the older clergy, it allowed sort of fresh ideas to come in, and meant that there was a group of priests who were ready to listen to Luther's ideas and become the next core of a future Protestant church. So there were many different things, many different chance things that contributed to the English Reformation. And we could say that when it's so many chance things, then it makes it possible for a pattern to emerge. Because if we take, say, throwing a die, then it can come up as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6, and each outcome is equally likely. So we can't really say anything about what the result will be. It's kind of pretty unpredictable. But if we throw 2 dice and add up the score, 2 dice, and we're adding up the score, then it's much more likely to come up as 7 than it is to come up as 2, because there are 6 ways you can make 7: 1 and 6, 2 and 5, 3 and 4, and so on. Whereas there's only one way to make a 2, which is to have 1 on each dice, on each die. And so already with 2 dice, we can say, well, what actually happens on each die is less important. But if we're thinking about the overall result, then there's a definite pattern. It's very likely to be a 7 and very unlikely to be a 2. And the same applies in society, because there are so many chance events going on. It's not like Cleopatra's nose, that because it depends on chance, then history becomes unpredictable. It's because there's so many things like Cleopatra's nose that actually makes it predictable, because within all these chance events, like in the dice, there can be some kind of overall pattern to it. And this perhaps relates to Durkheim's arguments. Durkheim on suicide. So each person's suicide is kind of a random event. It depends on, you know, their particular personality and the particular circumstances that have brought them to that point. So it's each one is kind of random, but when we look at the whole society, then there is a kind of pattern that emerges to suicide, and we see approximately the same number from year to year. And so it's because there's so many chance events going along, affecting so many people, that it's possible for there to be a pattern to it. We can't predict any one suicide, but we can say something about the overall number of suicides in society. So that is how you know, we go from unique tragedies of each individual suicide to a broader pattern. And then the same is true in history. We go from lots of individual agency adds up to an overall structure. So we're getting towards the idea of possibly being able to reconcile these. So let's have a look at that. So the question becomes not, you know, is it structure or is it agency, but how do these two things work together? So it's really kind of both. So we have here structure and here is individual agency. And the first point is that the social structure constrains the agency. We can't really just do anything we like. We have to work within what is possible given our circumstances and the world and society that we live in. So if we take, for example, Mozart, he composed some great music, some great symphonies, but he could only do that in the social milieu of his day, which you know, gave him orchestras and musical notation and other influences of other composers and the kind of music they composed that led him to express his genius in that particular way. If he had been born in the Stone Age, when, you know, the most that people had was a bone flute and a stick to knock a drum or something, he couldn't have produced those symphonies. If he'd been born in, you know, 9th century Persia, he wouldn't have produced those symphonies. So Mozart's music was is not attributable just to his individual genius, his individual agency, but was also affected by the milieu that he found himself in, the social structure that constrained and shaped what Mozart could achieve. But at the same time, the structure is in effect only an expression of what other people are doing, the agency of other people. So it was how other people were acting at that time, becoming musicians, writing music themselves, going to listen to performances, commissioning works. All that individual agency was producing the milieu in which Mozart was working. So the agency generates the structure. That is the basic argument that kind of attempts to reconcile the two. And a couple of sociologists who've, you know, explored this in detail, Pierre Bourdieu with his idea of habitus, and Anthony Giddens with his concept of structuration. Now, we don't need to go into these theories in detail. It's just to know that they're out there. Then, so Bourdieu's idea of habitus, you know, is an expression basically of that what people do becomes a template or model for their future actions, and what I do becomes a template for your future actions, and what you do becomes a template for my future actions. So we influence each other going through time, and Giddens is a similar kind of idea, that though he adds more detail and complexity to that picture. And the behavioural scientist Alex Pentland has suggested that we can relate these ideas of structure and agency to two types of human thinking, fast and slow. So when you're being chased by a tiger, you don't ponder what to do. You just run behind a bush. That is fast thinking, and you're not really making great decisions and choices. You're very much constrained by your environment. Tiger, bush, you just act. But if you're buying a new car, you don't just go on gut instinct. You get all the brochures and you go through the specifications of the different cars. You look at the price and you weigh up all the pros and cons, and eventually you come to a decision. That is slow thinking, and that is where your agency comes out, your unique personality and choice. So when we're seeing structure, we're seeing the effects of people's gut instincts, and when we go down to individual lives, we can see human agency and the results of slow thinking. And another way of thinking about this is in terms of complexity science, that this idea that structure constrains us. What that really means is that we as individuals exist within a social network of other people, and this network is very large and complicated. So if you are here trying to exercise your agency, you do it by interacting with other people. If you go into a shop, you're buying something from the shopkeeper who's bought it from someone else, and it's part of a much bigger economy. So what you can do with your agency is very much constrained by what's possible within this social network. And so it's not as though there's some kind of structure sort of stalking around and making things happen. It's not that there are laws of history that are written down. It's really just the properties of these social networks that constrain what we can do. And the properties of these social networks are in turn constrained by the limitations on human behaviour, such as, for example, how many friends we can have. We can't have 1 million friends. We're limited to typically 20 to 50 friends, something like that. So these social networks have properties that are constrained by things like the physical and psychological and biological influences on human behavior and human interaction, and also informational constraints, how much we can remember, how many faces we can recognize, that kind of thing. So yes, when we talk about structure, it's not a thing, but it's an emergent property of agency happening within social networks. And then to sort of go to the bottom line, where's this all taking us? I would say that we don't want to get bogged down in arguments about structure and agency, because at the end of the day it becomes rather like the chicken and the egg. You can just go round and round, and sometimes it seems like structure is important, sometimes it seems like agency, depends on which direction you're looking from. But as theoretical historians, we're interested in patterns, so let's not worry about whether, what the sort of philosophical significance of such patterns is, and whether they can even exist, and where they come from. Let's just go out, find patterns, then test those patterns, make predictions, and if those predictions turn out to be true, then say to ourselves, well, this pattern seems to work. We perhaps then will adopt that pattern as part of our theory, a part of our intellectual toolkit for looking at history, until maybe something comes along to contradict it and leads us to rethink and perhaps develop a better understanding of the patterns. So it's we're not going to resolve the debate of structure and agency, because even though, as I've just mentioned, there is some movement towards reconciliation, it's by no means something that people don't still argue about. It is something that, you know, people still have different views on. But we'll just get on with it. We'll just look for the patterns in history, and we'll know by the results whether or not we're on the right track.